Very good morning to you. It's 2 days to payday. We are sitting at the 28th of March, and if you've joined us, you have joined us on Fifth Connection, where we every weekday morning are in the biblical unfolding story of how God conducts Himself in His world. We're in the book of Hebrews because Hebrews tracks the idea of stick to itiveness and the great bargaining chip that we have as a result of sticking with Jesus. Press on, don't fall away. Believe, don't engage in unbelief as a lifestyle. Trust, don't distrust. Because that's the singular thing in view for these Christian Hebrews across 303 verses of the unfolding story, that they were to stick with Jesus. Whenever we think of a bargaining chip, we think of something that we can offer to give someone else when we are trying either to reach an agreement with them or in order to reach a deal or even to get an advantage for ourselves. That's what a bargaining chip is. And when we look at life and living, we see here in the unfolding text of this chapter, chapter 10, talks about a seasonal bargaining chip in the first four verses. The seasonal bargaining chip was the law and what the law stipulated. Once a year, the high priest would go into the tabernacle to offer sins or offer sacrifices on behalf of the people, to purge the people, to purge the sacred space where God would dwell. And then in verse 5 to verse 10, which is the section we want to look at this morning, the seasonal bargaining chips moves to an effectual one. It doesn't become a seasonal thing, but it becomes effective for a lifetime all the way into eternity. That's the effectual bargaining chip. And then in verse 11 of chapter 10 through to verse 14, it's the royal bargaining chip, which God Himself would effect as a result of the death of Christ on the cross. And so we see a very important shift in the text from seasonal to effectual to royal, all the way to royal. And to get into the royal bargaining position, the story is going to move through something very, very specific. And we will notice that the importance there is it would be the effectual bargaining chip that replaces the old and the seasonal one, in terms of what God desired to do. And so let's start up in verse number 5. It says, the text reads very clearly. Consequently, when Christ came into the world, He said, what did He say? Here's a quote from the Old Testament, Psalm 40. Sacrifices and offerings you have not desired, but a body you have prepared for me. In burnt offerings and sin offerings you have taken no pleasure. Then I said, behold, I have come to do your will, O God, as it is written of me in the scroll of the book. And so the quotation from the Old Testament is very important, because what makes the effectual bargaining chip better than the seasonal one is that in verse 5 to verse 7, the personal voluntary sacrifice of Christ, He did it on His own terms. It was voluntary. He tarry. He did it willingly. And here the writer is speaking as the son of David, the Davidite. Jesus fulfills David's words when he comes into the world by proclaiming um, from Psalm 40, verse 6, that God preferred his body to sacrifice and that he yielded his life to do the will of the Father. So he speaks as a son of David, and God preferred this Davidite, this son of David, to sacrifice over against sacrifice of anything else. So Jesus, as the son of David, proclaims that God preferred his body to sacrifice. So Jesus yields his life to do the will of the Lord. Now, this quote from Psalm 40 is very important. Um, it's Psalm 40, verse 6. It's a quotation from the Old Testament. And the Old Testament reads, sacrifices and offerings you have not desired, but the Old Testament says, an ear you have carved out. That's what the Masoretic text says. But here the writer of Hebrews is using a slight change, making a change in the text. And he says, a body you have prepared for me. Now, you have to do a deep dive here into the Septuagint, because the Old Testament version of uh, the law was very specific. So that is very, very important. It's specific because the New Testament writer says, a body you have prepared for me. Why is there a change here? Well, if you look at the Old Testament Septuagint, there's a Septuagint recension of this text that reads, a body you have prepared for me. The Masoretic text reads, an ear you have carved out. Why is the writer using the recension version? Because the writer is making a point, and the biblical point is that Jesus, as the Davidite, yields his body to do the will of the Lord. Jesus gives up his body. And so while you have many opinions on why the text is, there are different versions here and different explanations for what seems to be going on. I think the Samaritan recension, from which the writer quotes, makes the best sense. God prepared a body. How did he prepare this body? Well, Christ gave up himself voluntarily. And John 15, verse 13 says, greater love has no one than this, that a man lays down his life for his friends. And so there's something about voluntary sacrifice that is just so captivating, because it's where transcendence meets immanence. It's where heaven touches earth. There's something about giving your life for another that is so significant. And as you go up the ladder of watching how God places such a high premium on voluntary sacrifice, you see why it is that when Jesus gives his life, the cross becomes the watershed of history, especially in Western culture. But so that in every culture, the cross stands as a divide. Because when Jesus says, it is finished, he did not say the salvation work is done. What is in view is Old Testament animal sacrifices. The blood of bulls and goats. There's no need for that any longer. It is finished. No need to slit the throat of an animal and catch the blood. to atone for our hostility towards God. There's so much in that. It's our hostility toward God that is appeased. God didn't have to appease his own hostility. There was nothing to appease. It was our hostility and our enmity, our animosity toward him. And that's why he says in verse 6, in burnt offerings and sacrifices you have taken no pleasure. Then I said, the Old Testament text goes on to say, behold, I have come to do your will, O God, as it is written of me in the scroll of the book. So Jesus' sacrifice is voluntary. Jesus' sacrifice is also judicial. It supersedes judicially all sacrifices. And that's why verse 6 is so important. Quoting from Psalm 40, a body you have prepared for me. Now the last thing in verse number 10. Verse 8 says, when he said above, that's in the text, you have neither desired nor taken pleasure in sacrifices and offerings and burnt offerings and sin offerings. These are afforded according to the law. Then he added, what did he add? Behold, I have come to do your will. And he does away with the first order in order to establish the second order. First order was the old covenant. The second order was the new covenant. And now in verse 10, and by that will we have been sanctified. There's a perfect tense verb in the original text, a past action with continuing results into the present. By that will, by the will of that one, we have been set apart. We have been transformed through the offering of the body of Jesus Christ. There's that word again, that strange one, ephapax, once for all. So he did it. He gave his body willingly, voluntarily. It was a voluntary sacrifice. It was a judicial sacrifice, and it was practical because his personal voluntary sacrifice transforms those who embrace him practically. By Christ doing the will of God, the writer affirms that they have been consecrated, transformed, set apart through the offering of the body of Jesus Christ once for all. You see, across the Old Testament, the sacrifices covered, objectively covered. But since the cross, Christ's sacrifice subjectively cleanses and covers the internal, the conscience. No sacrifice could do that. Cleanse the conscience. But Christ's sacrifice did. And so, in a sense, these sacrifices were inadequate. They could go only so far and no further. So, what makes this sacrifice so efficacious, so effectual? Well, it's none other than the Son of God, the Davidic Son, this Davidite, Son of David, Jesus, what we call the theanthropic person, one who's fully God and fully man all at one and the same time, gives his life as a human sacrifice to appease our hostility toward God. And that's what makes the sacrifice so efficacious. Have you embraced that sacrifice this morning? Are you part of the family of God? Are you one who has entered in and claimed that bargaining chip with the future, which gives you access to the very throne room of God? Access which is forever, eternal. You don't have to come in with great fear and trepidation because He has opened up a new and living way. There's a lot of deep dives in this section of Hebrews chapter 10, going from 5 to 10. But I trust that your heart is encouraged as you grapple with the great sacrifice, the effectual sacrifice, which now is a perennial one. It doesn't have to be done over and over, or you don't have to go into the Holy of Holies with something in your hand. It's nothing in my hand I bring. It's simply to thy cross I cling, the writer says. And so this morning, let's bask in the sunlight of that effectual, perfect work of God the Son on our behalf. I trust that you would have a good day as you go with God. Goodbye for now.